welcome to Research Seminar Series number 3, Research Methods. What method best suits your research? So I thought we'd just start by looking at what we're talking about in the way of what sort of research. So health research, also known as medical research or clinical research, which really is just research done to learn more about human health. So it also aims to find better ways to prevent and treat disease, and is an important way to help improve the care and treatment of people. So the actual Australian government defines health and medical research as the systematic collection and analysis of information to better understand health issues or questions. So with the seminar series, we started off session 1 was looking at really honing in on the research question, the importance of the research question, and getting the basic ingredients right, because everything else sort of follows on from that. So we went through the question and the protocol. Then session 2, the wonderful Andrews from the library took us through how to do a lit search. This one's all about research methods and methodology and the differences between methods and methodology, and what's the best ones for different types of health research. And then the next 2 sessions will be Kevin taking us through some stats. So we went through the first one around what are you interested in, so getting the idea, exploring, developing and defining the topic, understanding current evidence around what we already know about the area, and then formulating research questions or hypothesis, why the topic that you want to research is an important thing to research, and then working out how you can answer the question, determining the information you'll need. So of course that leads on to what methods you're going to use and what overarching methodology you're going to use. So we went through the who, what, where, when, why and how. And that was to hone down and narrow down the research question. So looking at who the research participants are, what the issues surrounding the topic are, what are the subtopics, what are the gaps, and then where, so the geographic location, when is your topic current or historical, specific time periods, the why are you interested in it and why should others be interested, and then of course the how, which was the what kinds of information do you need, primary sources, statistics, etc., which brought us to what is your methodology. So we didn't go into that in the first session, which is why we're having a session on it now. And I accidentally put a blank slide in, just to wake me up. What's the difference between methodology and method? Anyone? Have a guess.
One is the overarching theoretical basis of it, and the other is how you actually do it.
Perfectly said. Pretty much methodology is the overarching strategy and rationale for your research project. It's a systematic and theoretical approach to collect and evaluate data throughout the research process. So it is exactly as you said, the framework, the sort of structure of what you're going to be doing. And methods, of course, are the specific tools and procedures that you're going to use to collect and analyse data. So, for example, the experiments, surveys and statistical tests. So it's the techniques, strategies and tools employed by a researcher to complete the experiment and or find a solution to the research problem. And it's interesting because methodology and methods, we interchange, we use them interchangeably, and I don't think it really matters too much, but in the protocol, your overarching research methodology is what the ethics committee and the members will look at to make sure that it is the appropriate sort of methodology overarching for that research, and then they'll look at which method fits that particular methodology and making sure it all sort of aligns and
so an example of methodology would be retrospective cohort study. something like that.
Yes. And that brings us to what are the three types? So there's three overarching types of research methodology. Anyone want to guess? Come on.
Retrospective?
No.
No,
It's contained within the type of research methodology. But the three types, and you know them well, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods.
Yeah.
So really in health research, you're going to use either qualitative research, quantitative research, or mixed methods, which all of those other techniques and tools come under. So in qualitative research, you know, it really is about gathering data around lived experiences, emotions, behaviours, sort of the meanings that individuals attach to them, and assists to gain a better understanding of more complex concepts, social interactions or cultural phenomena. And it's really useful for exploring how and why things have occurred, not just how often or numbers, etc. It sort of interprets events and describes the actions. Whereas the quantitative research methodology is around the numerical data that can be ranked, measured or categorised through statistical analysis. So you've probably got the bent for quantitative analysis,
I have.
whereas I'm probably more of qualitative analysis. But, you know, quantitative research with the ranking and measuring of data really helps uncover the patterns or relationships, and you can make generalisations from the results of that and the outcomes. So it's really useful for finding out how many, how much, how often, and to what extent. Whereas mixed methods, that's probably more my favourite, I've got to admit, because I think you get the best of both worlds. It integrates some qualitative and quantitative research methodology. So it really, to me, it provides a holistic approach because it combines the statistical data with deeper contextualised insights. So the data can tell you what, but the qualitative sort of component can tell you the context around why it's what.
No, I reckon the qualitative can populate a narrative as to why the numbers are as they are.
Exactly.
The narrative.
Yeah.
And the narrative is what people understand.
Yeah, they do. It's that
So
context around
if
it.
you're looking at something to investigate, get that qualitative to understand what their experience was when they went off and did their alternative treatment, how well they did it.
So yeah, patient experience surveys and all, you know, that's interesting because you usually use the mixed methods in that because you're asking some quantitative, some really closed questions, yes, no's, like at scale rankings for how satisfied the patient was with this or the other. But then you could also include some qualitative text comments around it and get a picture of why they've ranked it in that way. So it helps with triangulation or verification of the data from two or more sources. So which methodology should I use? So out of those three, really, if you want to measure something or test a hypothesis, use quantitative measures. Now you're looking at numbers, facts, experiments, and then analysing those facts. If you want to explore ideas, thoughts and meanings, then you'd use your qualitative methodologies. Mixed methods can help gain a more complete picture than a standalone quantitative or qualitative study, as it does integrate benefits of both those methods. There is, of course, some very complex and complicated trees and frameworks that can help you determine which sort of methodology and then methods would actually best fit your research design. And this one actually isn't too bad. It's from, and the reference there is the link on the website around the research design flowchart. And I've pushed each of the buttons on this, but when you first go into it, it has types of research designs. It has your quantitative on one side, and then qualitative on the other. And then depending how you answer each of the questions. So qualitative basically just gives you the drop-down box for what sort of methods you're going to use underneath your overarching qualitative methodology framework. So there's things like your grounded theory, your ethnography, phenomenal, I can never say that word.
Phenomenology.
Thank you. Descriptive, exploratory, action research, which is one of my favourites. Also called action research, translational research, evaluation research, feminist research, narrative research, self-inquiry, cognitive interviews, historical research and iterative designs. So they're your main sort of sub methods, I guess, underneath the broader qualitative design. And then your quantitative, and Kevin will probably go into this more with your statistical sessions, because it looks at are variables in the study manipulated or not. And then that's going to determine which sort of tree you go down. Because if it's yes, now you go down the experimental sort of path. And then you go through the is random assignment used, and then that walks you through the steps for the true experimental type quantitative designs, or your quasi-experimental designs where random assignment isn't used. So you can see from that tree it's can be fairly complex, but realistically, when you think about it, it's fairly simple. You're either going to measure something or sort of discuss and explore something, and then walk through the best approach that way. So I like to just bring it back to the basics and look at some of the more common sort of methods that fall underneath the broader methodologies. So with your qualitative methodologies, you know, some of the methods are your focus groups, which in health is probably one of the more common methods that we use, where you bring together a small group of people to discuss a given topic. That's usually led by a moderator who discusses, who leads the discussion, and tries to generate some insights about the topic under discussion. Pros and cons, of course, because focus groups, some people will speak up, others won't. Then are you going to audio record it, and then someone's got to transcribe it? Then you've got to identify your key themes from that. It can be fairly time consuming and onerous. But I found with the focus group stuff, rather than audio record and then transcribe, I was getting to the end of them and sort of on the whiteboard fleshing out, okay, this is the key themes I think I heard you talk about, that I think I heard you say, and then writing them on the whiteboard, or, you know, nowadays I guess computer, you know, do it through Miro or one of those software programs, and then getting a consensus that yes, you know, it sort of validates your findings then and there and reaffirms that yes, those are the key themes, rather than transcribing the whole thing, then trying to, you know, use a coding matrix or whatever to analyse the content and then send it back to participants for validation and then bring it back. So there's different ways to do all of these sort of methods or techniques. In-depth interviews, of course, asking some open-ended questions to elicit detailed responses from participants. And that's a really useful one when you want to really hone in on specifics from individuals. Typically one-on-one, they can be small groups, but it's very much more common to have one-on-one in-depth interviews. Observation, so qualitative methodology does include observation. So just observing people in their natural environment, can be structured or unstructured. Usually it's unstructured in qualitative. And of course, I can never say this word either, ethnography. Ethnography involves observing and immersing oneself in a culture. So that ethnographers will often spend an extended period of time in their research setting, getting to know the people and the culture. We've actually got an ethnographic study going on at the moment with Beck Broadbent and the team around the automated dispensing cabinets for medications. We're working with Monash and RMIT, I think it is, around that one. And yeah, some of the researchers have sort of come and spent some time observing how the nurses are reacting and reacting and working with the automated technology around medications. So it's quite an interesting one. And then of course you've got your common quantitative methods. So around descriptive research, which is used to explain the current state of a variable or topic. And that's where the researcher doesn't actually control or manipulate the variables at all. They just observe and measure them. So that's your surveys, your structured observations and case studies. And then correlation research, where you're investigating relationships between your study variables, also sort of called cause and effect. You can look at cause and effect under the correlation research with the variables. And experimental research, where you systematically examine whether there is actually a cause and effect relationship between the variables. Did I go through that one? Oh, the actual tools that sit under those methods. So the questionnaires and surveys, which is probably the most common tools we use really in health research. Nearly every research study, I think nowadays, has some sort of questionnaire or survey involved. And there's two types of surveys. There's your cross-sectional, which is conducted on a target population for a specified period, more like a sort of snapshot, and then a longitudinal sort of survey process where it's conducted at different time durations. And apologies for leaving the bracket off the end of that. Then you've got some structured observations where you observe specific behaviours of individuals in a very structured setting. And your experiments where you test a hypothesis through experiments in which one or more independent variables are manipulated and then their effect on dependent variables are studied. And that's your bread and butter, Kevin.
Yep, unfortunately.
You love it. So there's some really cool tables that can really just summarise the differences between quantitative research methodologies and qualitative research. So they go through the purpose and design. You know, if quantitative research really is around testing theories and the hypotheses, discovers the causal relationships, it's measurable and a lot more structured. Whereas your qualitative is much more likely to explore some ideas, and it doesn't test a hypothesis, but it might help formulate a hypothesis for further study. It helps understand the phenomenon. I'm really having trouble with my words today. It really helps to understand the phenomena or topic of interest in the research. It's a lot more subjective and descriptive and describes a more complex topic or issue. The research question parameters, so quantitative is much more conclusive questions like what, when and where. You know, what's the association between maternal age and developmental delay in children? So that's something you can measure. Exploratory questions under qualitative research are more likely to be your how and your why. So for example, why do customers prefer product A to product B? The sample size in quantitative is much larger usually than in qualitative research. Qualitative, you can get quite a small sample and it's still quite valid. And of course your data in quantitative is a lot more structured, measurable and numeric, or ranked or ratings, whereas in qualitative it's much less structured not measurable, can't be quantified, and it could be text or images. The data collection methods we went through before. So it really is around, experiments, controlled observations, questionnaires, surveys. Usually there's a rating scale and closed questions. Whereas with the surveys in qualitative research and the semi-structured interviews, they're very much open-ended questions. So you try and be as open-ended as possible to draw out all of the detail around the topic under review, rather than closed yes, no's, or things like the what and when's. Could be document study, could be literature reviews, focus groups, case study research, and of course we've talked about ethnography. And then in quantitative research, your data analysis is much more deductive. So you've got your hypothesis that's been developed at the beginning, and that's what you're trying to measure, whether your hypothesis is proven or not. So it uses precise measurements and statistical analysis using applications such as Excel, SPSS and R, which is Kevin's favourite now.
Love it.
Whereas in qualitative research, the hypothesis is usually developed after data collection. It's much more inductive, and it categorises data into patterns, not precise measurements. So there's, you look at the data or the information, and you can look at the content. You tend to analyse the content, not what, not the actual precise measurements. So it determines presence of certain words, concepts in text, grounded theory, the hypothesis creation by data collection and analysis, and of course thematic analysis, which is really to identify important themes and patterns in the data. And then we use these to address an issue. And it's the same with data collection and analysis. In quantitative, it's very much predetermined, and in qualitative, it's very much emerging. Quantitative, it's instrument-based questions. You look at performance data, attitude data, observational data. That's where census data is looked at, and involves statistical analysis, whereas qualitative is much more open-ended, interview data, audio, visual, text and image analysis.
Developing themes, which, nowadays there is software packages. Even SurveyMonkey nowadays has a bit of a qualitative sort of thematic component in it as well. And you can do word clouds and things like that. And even sentiment analysis, which is quite an interesting one. And it reads sort of the sentiment behind the text that's put in the comment sections, and it comes out with either a smiley face or a frowny face, and whether it's mainly positive comments or mainly negative comments, which is quite cool. Not sure how valid it would be in academic life, but it's an interesting way. Well, it's a limited application of artificial intelligence.
I was going to say, is it
And
just AI?
And then it depends
AI
how
learning.
they constructed the AI. Yeah, yeah.
And then of course there's your NVivo, which is a lot more rigorous and robust for qualitative analysis and looking at your content. I must admit I like the old-fashioned Excel spreadsheet and going through and finding keywords and highlighting them and using a coding matrix to identify the common words and then common themes, and then the overarching theme that some of the subtext might sit under.
Yep.
I think it's not a bad way to go. And I think that's why I like mixed methods more, because it's sort of, you can, I like surveys where you can do your Likert scale ratings and rankings, and then your comments underneath each of those helps explain the meaning behind why they gave that particular ranking.
Yeah. But of course, there's pros and cons to everything. And some of the pros of your qualitative research are around exploring attitudes and behaviour really in depth. So it gives you a lot more devil in the detail around the context of why people say what they say or do what they do, or around the topic of interest. It encourages discussion, which usually fleshes out some of the issues and gives a lot more contextual sort of perspective to the results, and it's fairly flexible, you can change. Whereas with quantitative research, you know, the larger sample sizes definitely help with generalisability, depending of course on your power calculations and
Or whether it's random or not.
And
Yeah.
all of the different things that you'll learn in Kevin's seminars in September and October.
Indeed.
There is, you know, quantitative research is probably a lot more impartial and therefore some would say more accurate. It's faster and easier to, well, sometimes that depends on the data too, doesn't it? You'd think it's faster and easier, but sometimes cleaning the data and making sure that you can analyse it correctly using the appropriate queries.
It's interesting, isn't it? If in say a national political poll, the 24 million people, how many people are voting? Maybe 16 million or something. And you only need a sample size of 1,000 if it's random.
Okay.
But if it's not random, then your political poll means nothing. But if it is random, you only need 1,000 to generalise to 16 million. Yeah. So the political polls are typically around about 1,000. It's the same in the US. The US polls are only about 1,000.
Really?
Yeah, but they spend nearly all of their time getting the random sample.
Okay.
And if it's truly random, 1,000's enough.
So random as opposed to stratified.
Yeah, well, there's lots of ways samples get skewed. And so, you know, online sampling is convenient sampling because people who are really good at online stuff will tend to do the survey, and people who are not comfortable with that won't do it. So it's a skewed sample. So, but if it's truly random, the sample size in quantitative stats can be relatively small and your sample size can be too big.
Wow.
Yeah, so the sample size of that low dose aspirin on cardiac infarcts was too big. It was a sample size of 62,000 and the effect size got so small that the conclusion was that low dose aspirin was good for cardiac health, but the effect was minuscule.
Wow.
You know, so is it worth doing low dose aspirin? No, because the effect is so small, but because your sample size is so big, the effect was there, but not meaningful.
Because everyone, like in your stats courses, you always taught the bigger sample, the better sort of thing, isn't it? And,
There's a
you know, you've got your total population, so you've got to get this many for your confidence interval to be plus, you know, over 85%.
And that's why the effect size part of the sample size is really important, because the effect size has to be meaningful, and the sample size can be too big.
Well, there you go. I did not know that.
So the aspirin heart infarct one was a very good example. And out of that one study came the urban myth that aspirin was good for your heart by thinning your blood. And out of that one study came an urban myth, and it was being disproved as being, well, it's there, but it's so minusculely impactful on your health, has to be not worth it.
Wow. Well, there you go.
Yeah, but coming back to it, sample size for what you do is important. And right now I'm dealing with another allied health little researcher, and his issue is sample size. especially when you're comparing groups. So you had two main groups and they were subdivided into 4 more groups. So that's 8 groups.
So you go B.
And if you're doing group comparisons, you've got to have an adequate sample size for 8 groups. Otherwise, dividing it into 8 groups means nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that bedevils allied health a lot, because it's hard for you guys to get masses and masses and masses of measurements for a single patient. You know what I mean? Takes work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's effort to get the sample size up. So effort versus utility. And I'm dealing with another guy who's trying to get the sample size up, but it's a huge amount of effort. Yeah.
Bit like our Melly Healthcare work at COVID study that we're going to meet about again this afternoon.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Trying to get that sample size up because, attrition after, when you're trying to do a longitudinal study over 3 years and in a healthcare workforce that's been rocked and decimated and has constant turnover and all the rest of it, trying to follow a cohort of, what have we got, 1,300?
13, and then some of those are labile junior medical staff that come and go all the time. So they've gone, most of the junior medical staff are gone, so we can't resample them. It's just, these are the practicalities, isn't it?
That's it. And it's, again, and I guess that one, you'd call it a mixed methods, even though it's a longitudinal cohort study design. Really, the methodology is mixed methods because we're using some validated survey tools with very closed questions and rankings and ratings and Likert scales. But then we've also got some very qualitative sort of comment sections and things like that, haven't we? So,
yeah. And there are instruments with scores. So, and it looks like a nice numeric scale, but nevertheless, it's based on people's opinions. Yeah.
So even though they say quantitative research is faster and easier, sometimes it's not.
No,
So-
getting the sample size can be a real big effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And data is usually anonymous in quantitative research, whereas in qualitative, when you're doing focus groups and one-on-one interviews, it's a bit hard for it to be anonymous. And you can, of course, de-identify the data post interviews and post focus groups and all, but it can be an issue.
So can I ask you a question about that? Is it a good idea to have a separate function where you've got an interviewer and who gets it and deals with the people, and passing the information on to somebody who was not present and who wasn't swayed by being yelled at or something? You know what I mean? And who can look at it a bit more objectively?
It depends. I know when I did the qualitative component of my PhD thesis, I used another girl to go through the coding matrix and all. Like, I did all the interviews.
Yeah.
And I got I think there was 100 or so, and we got them transcribed by a transcription service. So that was sort of objective, just transcribing word for word. Then they came back to me and another researcher who went through and did the coding matrix and themed them all into their common themes. And we came up with pretty much exactly the same stuff. So I guess it can be skewed by the interviewer analysing their own data, but there's a couple of arguments, each way for that. I suppose it can bias because you've been in there and might have taken offence or been yelled at, as you say, and that'll skew sort of your perspective on the data.
Your response to that person's responses. Yeah.
But then it can also help, you can...
The nuances of the body language.
Yep, the body language and the context in which people are saying it, the tone of voice, the actual way they're sitting and all can actually help, and you can draw things out.
Yeah.
And then when you're writing it up, you sort of know that, oh, well, they were really anxious around them when they said that. So the context of that comment,
Yep.
you know, you sort of know that. So real pros and cons for who.
Well, it depends on the topic, what you're researching too.
Yeah, it does. Depends on the topic of research.
And so how does that go with focus groups and ethics applications and privacy? How does that work?
Well, as long as there's informed consent and you know, your focus group participants, you're recruiting them, you know, in a valid way and an ethical way, and they're attending and they sign, you know, the information consent form, you set the focus group rules straight away that it's, you know, all confidentiality and no one's to sort of break confidence when they leave the focus group that, oh, she said that and all the rest of it. Yeah.
So does the national statement deal with that? I haven't read it for a long time, so I was just wondering about that. If that's part of the national statement.
Yeah, it really is just around the guiding principles, and then your national privacy principles and your health privacy principles, and then the Victorian specific ones as well. So it's
So there are ways to navigate knowing who the people are in the context of the national statement and the privacy principles, that the Australian and the Victorian and the health. There are ways to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it all comes down to informed consent, really.
Yeah.
As long as people know what they're agreeing to, know the ground rules, you set the ground rules, and they're happy to participate.
You wouldn't have someone who was providing intervention from the focus group.
No.
That's where you'd separate it.
Yeah.
To
Good point, Sharon.
Yeah, almost like blinding, isn't
Yeah.
it? In your controlled trials.
because the participants have that, they want to say the right thing, because you're the person who's doing this for
without fear or
Exactly.
favour.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And that boils down to that unequal relationship thing
Mm.
that you know, can happen in all research, whether it's quantitative or qual.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, some of the cons we've just talked about. You know, cons of qualitative could be sample size, but it could be bias in the sample selection too. And whether you're using a skilled moderator or not, because focus groups and even semi-structured or structured group interviews or individual interviews, you know, there is a skill involved. You don't just, you know, pop out and start asking questions, particularly in focus groups and get eaten.
One of the things that I've been involved in since I've worked at Bendigo Health, Ange, is being involved in some projects centrally coordinated by Department of Health. And so, you know, you go along to a meeting in Melbourne with all your equivalents in the different hospitals sitting in a big room, and then there's a moderator who is asking questions and you're filling in bits of paper, and it's the same thing. They're actually doing a qualitative research thing, and they hire, the ones I've been involved in, they hired a professional moderator to do it, to deliver it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a definite skill in it, and it does.
Yeah.
You know, there's different courses you can do, and there's, you know, years ago, I remember Bendigo Health did the facilitator course. I did a couple of different ones, and it was, it was quite handy. It had nothing to do with research at the time, but they were facilitating something. I think it might have been around the strategic plan. But
Yeah, digging into the question.
I was involved in evaluation of the post-funding evaluation of the MARAM. And we had to sign consent forms for that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Lapsing funding evaluation.
that's right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, cons in quantitative research methodologies can be, you know, you are limited by set answers on a survey, and you can't really follow up on the answers that are given. Whereas in a focus group or in individual interviews, you know, someone says something, you go, oh, and you can clarify the meaning behind it. So what did you actually mean by that? Or, you know, what influenced your response there? Whereas in quant, you just can't follow that up. And usually in quantitative research isn't carried out in a person's normal environment, which could influence their responses. And then, of course, your mixed methods combines the pros and cons of each, I suppose. So combining, the pros is that combining the quantitative and qualitative approaches can balance out the limitations of each method, can provide stronger evidence and more confidence in your findings, and gives a more complete understanding than each individual method. But the cons, of course, can be more complex to carry out because you're being a quantitative and qualitative research methodology expert, really. So it does require a bit more expertise to collect and analyse the data and to interpret the results than using one or the other method would. And combining the different methods requires extra resources, such as time and money, of which we're usually time and money poor. So when you're considering which research methodology to use, there are just a few factors that can help with that decision. And that's, when researchers know what their real objective is, then they know what information they'll require at the end of the project to meet their objectives. So it helps select the correct methodology and method. So really going back to the objectives of the research, is it the what, when, and how, or is it the whys? The significance of statistics. So consider whether you really do require that concise data-driven research results and statistical answers, or whether the questions require more an understanding of the reasons, perceptions, opinions and motivations of people. The nature of the research. So if the aims and objectives are exploratory, then the research will probably require qualitative data collection methods. However, if the aims and objectives are to measure or test something, then you're more likely to require quantitative data collection methods. And of course, as we were talking about before, the sample size. So how big does the sample need to be to answer the research questions and meet the objectives? And the size can determine your data gathering methods. So whether to use in-person interviews for smaller samples or online surveys for larger ones, for example. And last but not least, of course, is your time availability. If there's time constraints, then consider techniques like random or convenience sampling, as you were talking about before, Kevin, and tools that allow for data collection in a few days. If there's more time available for data collection, in-person interviews and observations are more possible, of course.
So one of the things about time availability is to query retrospective data, because the data already exists.
Yes.
So you can do it quite quickly.
Yeah. So in summary, research methods are individual tools, techniques or behaviours a researcher uses to collect information, whereas the research methodology is a specific way of conducting research that may incorporate multiple research methods. So it details the what, where and how of data collection and analysis. So just some of the things to think about when we're looking at our questions and what we want to know and how we're going to get the information, the best way to get the actual information. So it will determine the tools and techniques. Your methodology will determine the tools and techniques that you use to answer the question. The end. Thank you, and feel free to contact me or the Research and Innovation team for support, advice or assistance.